Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about different types of body movements. Now, the vocabulary words we are about to learn today are really important for anybody heading into any career that's in the medical field anywhere. The reason for that is we need to be specific about what type of movement it is that we are talking about. For example, if you are taking like a medical history on a patient and you need to be able to note the type of injury the person had or what they were doing when the injury occurred, we need to be very, very specific. We can't just say, oh, the patient was lifting their arm. Well, lifting their arm how? In what movement? In what direction? In what plane? Um, and so we need to be able to accurately and precisely describe the movement, so that anybody who then picks up that chart and sees that description, they'll know exactly what was happening. Another example could be if you are an athletic trainer or a physical therapist, and somebody is injured on the field, and you run out on the field to help or whatever, and you're trying to describe to somebody else what you want them to do, and you say, okay, lift their leg. Well, that's a different movement if the person is on their back or on their side or on their stomach. And so we want to be able to precisely describe to whoever is helping us the exact movement we want them to do, right? So we don't injure our patient or our athlete any further. Okay, so these body movements we are going to go through. The first one is flexion. So flexion is bringing a movement that brings two bones closer together, or is like a bending at a joint. So we have a lot of joints in our body where we can do the movement of flexion. So I'm just going to start at the top and work our way down. So in this picture here, you can see the kind of middle picture right here. This person, that's the anatomical position. That's our neutral position. So flexion of the neck is when we bring the chin down towards our chest. So that's flexion of the neck. So everybody try that right now. Bring your chin down towards your chest. Okay, that's flexion of your neck. All right, the next joint where we see flexion is at our shoulder. So in our shoulder joint, flexion is when we bring our arm straight forward, not out to the side. That's a different descriptor, and we'll get to that in a moment. But flexion is when we bring the arm straight forward. Okay, so that's flexion of the shoulder joint. We can also have flexion at our elbow joint. So that's this picture here. So flexion of the elbow joint is when we bring the lower portion of the arm up towards our like bicep. Okay, so flexion of the elbow joint, everybody try that. It's where you bring your elbow, or you bring your lower part of your arm up towards the upper part of your arm. That's flexion at the elbow joint, right? So we're bringing two bones closer together. That was our definition. And so we're bringing, the bones in the lower portion of the arm up towards the humerus. Right, we can also have flexion at the wrist. And so notice the movement there. It's basically bringing the palm towards the lower half of your arm. So that's our flexion of the wrist. Right, we can also have flexion of our hip. And so whether you're moving your body forward or moving your leg up towards your body, basically it's when your leg, or like your thigh bone or whatever, is the angle between your torso, and that is lessened, right? So that would be flexion would be bringing either your torso down towards your thigh joint, your thigh, or bringing your thigh up towards your abdomen. All right, so that's flexion of the of your hip. We can also have flexion at our knee. And so flexion of our knee is actually when we bring our lower half of our leg back. So everything else, flexion was coming forward. Like if we were standing in anatomical position, all the other joints, flexion was bringing the movement forward. Except at the knee, flexion of the knee is actually moving the body limb backwards. And so knee flexion, so basically bringing the lower portion of the leg up towards the upper portion of the leg, that would be knee flexion. Now, at our ankle, we do see flexion, but it's given a special term that we'll cover later. So that's why I'm not talking about it here. All right, so we see flexion in all sorts of joints in our body. Our next vocab word is extension. So that's basically the opposite of flexion. So if flexion was bringing two bones closer together, then extension is increasing that angle or distance between two bones or part of the body straightens out at a joint. All right, so let's try that again. We'll kind of work our way from the top to the bottom. So we can see extension in our neck. So if you were in flexion, like if your chin was down towards your chest, if you were in flexion and you brought your head back up towards the neutral position, this kind of middle picture we see here, that would be the movement of extension. So if you're already in flexion with your neck like down, your chin down towards your chest, and you bring it back up to our anatomical position, then that would be extension. But at this joint, we also have the ability to go into what's called hyperextension. So we went beyond that anatomical position, beyond that normal starting point, and continued in that movement. And so that's considered hyperextension of our neck. Right? We can also see extension at our shoulder. Right, so I said add this picture and I realized it was missing. I'm talking about extension at the shoulder joint. So if you're already in flexion, remember flexion is when we moved our arm straight forward, not out to the side, but straight forward. From our side here, if we go straight forward, that would be in flexion. So again, if we're already in flexion and we bring our arm back down to the neutral position, that'd be extension. But at our shoulder, we also have the ability to move our arm into hyper extension. So if we take the arm from neutral position back even further, that's considered hyper extension at our shoulder joint. Our elbow joint. So typically moving to extension again if you're in flexion. Moving to extension would be extending it out completely, that whole straightening of a joint. Our elbow is not typically a joint where we would see hyperextension. Usually if you end up with hyperextension at your elbow, there's some sort of injury that has occurred. We'll eventually learn there's some bone structures in our elbow that prevent the hyperextension from occurring. And so if they do, most likely you have a broken bone then. Not always, but that's likely the case. Okay, so again, extension of the elbow is when we bring our arm back down into anatomical position. And then extension of the wrist is where we bring the back part of our hand back to where our forearm is. And then again, extension of the of your hip joints. So again, flexion is when you're leaning forward. Extension would be getting back up to anatomical position, or hyperextension would be leaning back even farther. All right, and then extension of our knee. So again, flexion is when we brought the lower half of the leg up and we're bringing it up towards the upper part of our leg, but from the back side. Well, extension is when we bring it straight back down. All right, so here's a quick little picture. It's showing some of the muscles that we'll eventually learn about, but it's talking about the movements of flexion. And so it says that a muscle that crosses the anterior side of a joint produces flexion. So for example, here we have the pectoralis major, which most people just call their pecs. So see how where that is inserting onto the humerus bone. So that's on the anterior side. That's the front side of the body. That's producing a flexion movement. It's when that muscle contracts, it's one of the muscles that helps pull our arm forward. Now, muscles that cross on the posterior side of a joint produce extension. So this is our latissimus dorsi, but the way it comes and attaches to the arm, when it contracts, it's part of what helps pull that arm back into extension or even hyperextension. All right, so our next movement we're going to talk about is rotation. So rotation is the movement of a bone around its longitudinal axis. So for example, if you look at our neck, so rotation, think of shaking your head no, like how you would move your head back and forth to say no. That's rotation at our neck. We also see rotation at our shoulder and hip, but those get a slightly more precise term. So we have medial rotation, and that's when your joint medially rotates the limb towards the midline. So in this gentleman here with his arm bent, so the internal rotation or the medial rotation, those are saying the same thing. It's when his arm was in neutral position and it rotated in and brought his forearm into his stomach. Or the girl standing over here, your arm could also be an extension and still do medial rotation. So this little elbow or this little kind of circle here is showing the arm rotating in towards that midline. Remember, the middle of our body. So that medial rotation is when that arm rotates in towards the middle. Same thing at our hip joint. Medial rotation would be kind of rotating the leg in towards that midline. Okay, and then we also have lateral rotation or external rotation. And that's when the joints are laterally rotated or the limb is turned away from the midline. So again, the internal rotation or the medial rotation of the shoulder brought the forearm, in front of your stomach or abdomen. Lateral rotation or external rotation would move it out, away from it. So away from the midline. So that was our lateral movement that we talked about before, our lateral direction. And then same thing, you can see when the arm is extended, lateral rotation will be rotating, like at your shoulder, rotating your arm out, or even at the hip, lateral rotation would be rotating the leg outward. So think about away from the midline. Okay, so that's rotation. So again, we saw rotation at the neck. That was a shaking of the head no. But we also see rotation at our shoulder and hip joints. They just get a little bit more specific of a term. So if the rotation was in towards the midline, that's medial. So again, bringing the arm in. Or if we're taking the arm out away from the body, that's lateral or external rotation. All right, now we need to compare that to what's called abduction and adduction. So that's the medial and lateral rotation is different than abduction and adduction. So abduction, so AB, abduction, is when the limb moves away from the body, but in that frontal plane. So think about the shoulder earlier. Earlier in the shoulder, we talked about flexion. And I was very, very specific. And I said, okay, in flexion, it's when you take your arm straight forward, not out to the side, but straight forward. That's flexion of the shoulder. Well, now we're talking about abduction. So abduction is when we move the arm away from the body, but it stays with the palm, kind of facing forward. So we're moving in that frontal plane, but we're moving away from the midline or the middle of the body. Okay, so abduction means you're moving away. Same thing with your leg. Abduction is when you move your leg away from the midline. So that's abduction. You'll hear people say it that way a lot. So abduction, again, is moving away from the midline. The opposite of that is adduction, or some people will actually say adduction. To make sure you're hearing the difference, because abduction and adduction sound very, very similar. So adduction is the opposite of abduction. You're moving the limb towards the midline. So adduction is bringing it back in. Okay, same thing with our arm. Adduction is bringing the arm back down towards our side. So the best way I had to help me remember the difference between these is adduction. Think of adding. You're adding the limb back onto the body, or you're adding it to the width of the body. So adduction is moving it in. Abduction, abduction, like if somebody is abducted, they're taken away. So abduction is when you move the limb away from the midline. So whether it's your arm or your leg. So abduction, moving the limb away from the midline. Adduction is moving the limb back towards the middle. Right, so here's another graphic, again, using some muscles. We'll learn muscle terms later. I'm not worried about you memorizing muscles right now. But this muscle right here that's on our shoulder, kind of our shoulder, right here we can see that's the deltoid. And so that muscle, when contracted, is one of the muscles that helps produce abduction, right? Because it's on the lateral side of the joint, right? It's lateral, it's outside, away from the midline of the joint. And so that's going to help produce abduction. Muscles that crosses on the medial side, so it's coming on the inside part of the arm, is going to help produce adduction. It's going to help pull the arm back into that anatomical position. Right, so again, the shoulder muscle or deltoid muscle helps with abduction, moving the arm up away from the body. The muscles that cross on the medial side help produce adduction, bringing that arm back down, adding it back down onto the body. All right, so the next movement is called circumduction. It's like a weird combination of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, like all at once. So basically this can happen at the shoulder or the hip joint. And the idea is that the proximal end of that limb is stationary, or as stationary as can be. And the distal end moves in a circle. Okay, so true abduction is just moving the arm out away, and adduction is bringing the arm back down in, staying in that frontal plane. Circumduction is when, again, you have a little bit of extension, flexion, abduction, adduction all together,
because this proximal end of the limb stays stationary, but this distal end is going to rotate in a circle. Same idea when it happens with our hip joint. This proximal end of the limb stays as stationary as possible, and you rotate your foot around to make a circle. Okay, now the next few are what we call specialized movements. They only happen at a few joints, like they're specific to that joint, or that particular movement maybe only happens at one joint. So dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Earlier I mentioned that when we talk about flexion of the ankle, it's specific, and so that's why we didn't talk about it just as flexion earlier. So of the ankle, there is no extension. It's either dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. We don't talk about extension. So dorsiflexion is when you move your foot up. So basically when you pull your toes up towards the anterior part of your leg, towards the front of your leg. So dorsiflexion is when you pull your foot up, or you pull those toes up towards the front of your leg. So try that really fast. See what that movement feels like. That's dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is when we plant our toes, or pointing our toes down towards the ground, or moving it towards, remember we talked before that the bottom of the foot was called the plantar side of the foot. So plantar flexion is moving your foot in that plantar direction. And so that's called plantar flexion of our ankle. So again, no extension. We just either talk about dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. Now, the ankle doesn't only move in that plane. It doesn't only move in those two directions. The ankle, we also get a little bit of kind of like a rotation, but we don't call it a rotation, in and out. Or almost kind of like an abduction, adduction type of thing, but we don't call it that. It's inversion and eversion. So inversion is when you take it and you kind of rotate your the plantar side of your foot, so the bottom of your foot, rotate it in towards the midline of the body. So the sole of your foot is rotated medially. That's inversion. So go ahead and try that with your foot. See what that movement feels like. A lot of times when people roll their ankle, it's an inversion roll. That's a lot easier way, or the anatomy, the way our body is built. It's a lot easier, and you get a lot more movement with an inversion movement. Eversion is when you take the sole of your foot and move it laterally, move it towards the outside of your leg. So go ahead and try that with your foot really fast. You're going to see you don't get as much movement, or typically people don't get as much movement eversion. And when we learn about the bones of the leg and the way the structures are set up, you'll see why. The bone that's coming down over here comes down a little bit further, and so it's kind of blocking some of that movement. So the bone that comes down to make our ankle bones, it's kind of blocking some of that eversion movement. Right, so inversion, again, taking the sole of the foot, turning it internally or medially. Eversion is taking the sole of the foot and turning it outwards, or turning it laterally. So at the ankle, we talked about dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and then we talked about inversion, eversion. All right, now in our forearm, we actually get this unique movement. So again, in anatomical positions, there's two bones in our forearm. If you didn't know, we have two small bones in our forearm like this. And when we're in standard anatomical position, they're lined up straight like this. Well, part of the anatomy, the way that our bones are set up, again, we'll talk about it when we learn all the bones. But part of the way it's set up is it allows us to pronate our hand, and what happens is the two bones actually end up crossing over each other when we do that. So supination, think about it as like having your hand out in front of you, and think about it as holding a bowl of soup. If you're holding soup in your hand, you would need to cup your hand. I think this is the funniest mnemonic they have for remembering things. But so supination, think about holding soup in your hand. So that's when the hand is in supination. That's when the bones are lined up parallel with each other. So pronation is when we would take our hand and put palm side down. So supination, you have palm side up because you have soup in your hand. You're holding soup in your hand. Pronation is when you put palm side down. And when we do that, when we rotate or when we pronate our hand down, we end up crossing those two bones. They're currently crossed when you do that. All right. So again, supination is when we are palm up, so we can hold that soup. Pronation, think palm down. We're rotating, or pronating, which ends up getting the two bones to cross each other. All right, and then the last movement we're going to talk about is opposition, and that's the fact that we can bring our fingers and thumbs together. So you might have heard somebody talk about humans having an opposable thumb. That's because of this movement of opposition, that we can bring our fingers and thumbs together in the kind of like a pinching motion. And so again, that's where the term opposable thumb comes from. Okay, so there are other movements we can do in our body, but these are kind of the main ones that we will see in our course, that we will be using that vocabulary. All right, guys, I will talk to you later. Bye.